when Soviet tanks seemed poised to sweep across Western Europe, NATO planners weighed an unthinkable defense: the calculated flooding of vast Dutch landscapes, turning homes and farms into deliberate obstacles to stop an invasion at any cost. The strategy was shrouded in secrecy and rife with risk, not just for the enemy, but for the very civilians it was meant to protect. How far were Western allies willing to go? And what did this reveal about the true price of Cold War security? The answer begins with a plan most never knew existed. Soviet armored divisions, built for speed and shock, loomed as the nightmare scenario for Western Europe in the early years of the Cold War. Intelligence briefings estimated that if the Warsaw Pact launched a surprise offensive, their tanks could reach the Dutch border in less than 48 hours. The geography of the Netherlands, flat, open, and threaded with rivers, offered little natural shelter. Major highways and railways pointed straight toward the heart of the country, and the low-lying polders that had been reclaimed from the sea for centuries now looked dangerously exposed. NATO planners watched as Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks drilled for river crossings and rapid advances across the North German plain. The Dutch military ran war games that ended with enemy armor rolling past Arnhem and threatening the ports of Rotterdam and Amsterdam before reinforcements could even assemble. Every minute counted. The sheer momentum of an armored spearhead, backed by artillery and mechanized rifle divisions, threatened to overwhelm static defenses and leave little time for orderly retreat or counterattack. For Dutch commanders, the prospect was chilling. The lines on their maps traced not just the routes of possible attack, but the boundaries of towns, farms, and entire communities that would be caught in the path of war. The question was no longer whether the enemy could reach the heart of the Netherlands, but how quickly and what, if anything, could stop them. In that climate of anxiety, the search began for measures that went beyond the limits of conventional defense, even if it meant turning the country's own landscape into a weapon. Rumors of a British or NATO order to flood the Netherlands have echoed for decades, but the historical record tells a different story. The plan to inundate the Dutch heartland was not imposed from London or Brussels. It was drafted in The Hague, conceived by Dutch officers who saw no acceptable alternative to sacrificing their own land if invasion came. In the early 1950s, as Cold War fears deepened, Captain Joop Hayeks led a small group in the Dutch Ministry of Defense to outline a new defensive line along the IJssel River. Their documents, stamped with the highest security classifications, described a system of dams and sluices that could divert water from the Rhine and Waal, flooding a corridor 127 kilometers long through the eastern provinces. The goal was to buy precious days for Dutch and Allied forces by turning flat farmland into a muddy barrier that no Soviet tank could cross quickly. Military historian Dr. Frank Ledwidge explains that the IJssel line was a unique solution. It was born from a refusal to accept the idea of abandoning the western cities to an enemy advance. The Dutch wanted to control their own fate, even if it meant preparing for the flooding of their own countryside. No British directive ever ordered the destruction of Dutch dikes or pumping stations. The IJssel Line was a Dutch contingency, developed in close coordination with NATO, but always under Dutch command. The secrecy was absolute. Even as Soviet reconnaissance detected construction, the Dutch public remained unaware for more than a decade. The myth of foreign control fades in the face of archival evidence. The decision to weaponize water belonged to the Netherlands alone. Flooding one's own land is a decision born of calculation, not impulse. For Dutch military planners, water was the last line of defense, a weapon to be used only when all other options had failed. The logic was ruthless and precise: to slow the Soviet advance by turning familiar fields into a quagmire, trading crops and homes for days of resistance. The provinces marked for inundation were not chosen lightly. Gelderland, Overijssel, and parts of Utrecht stood at the crossroads of invasion routes and river systems. Their fate was sealed in confidential orders, locked away from public scrutiny. Only a handful of officials, engineers, and senior officers ever saw the full clearance list. Access to the plan was tightly controlled, with names recorded in classified registries and meetings held behind closed doors. The technical details, locations of dams, the sequence for opening sluices, and the depth targets for each polder were compartmentalized to prevent leaks. Even within the Ministry of Defense, few understood the full scope of what was being prepared. The secrecy was not just about hiding intentions from the Soviets. It was about shielding Dutch society from the knowledge that, in the event of war, entire communities could become deliberate obstacles. The calculus was cold. Better to lose land temporarily than to lose the country entirely. Yet this logic came at a cost. The moral burden of writing off towns and farms as expendable terrain weighed heavily on those entrusted with the plan. In the shadows of the Cold War, the line between protection and sacrifice blurred, and the true price of security was measured not only in military terms, but in the quiet forfeiture of trust between state and citizen. The order to flood the IJssel Valley would have triggered a precisely engineered sequence. At designated command, operators would close the massive floating dams on the lower Rhine and Waal, diverting thousands of cubic meters of river water every minute into the prepared intake works along the IJssel. Within hours, sluice gates and inlets would channel water into the low-lying polders, overwhelming drainage systems designed to keep the land dry. Pumps, usually the guardians of Dutch farmland, would be shut down or reversed, ensuring that every drop stayed inside the defensive perimeter. According to technical estimates, the water would spread rapidly, reaching depths between half a meter and 1.2 meters across a 127-kilometer corridor. The process, modeled by hydrodynamic simulations decades later, showed that within 6 hours, fields, roads, and even small villages could be underwater deep enough to bog down tanks and make wheeled vehicles unusable. A hydrologist from Rijkswaterstaat later described the operation. The system was designed for controlled inundation. Timing was everything. If the order came too late, the enemy would be past the line. And if it came too early, our own troops could be trapped on the wrong side. The risks extended far beyond the enemy. Water does not recognize front lines. Inundation could cut off Dutch and Allied units still east of the line, isolating them from retreat or reinforcement. Mud and debris would clog escape routes, and the same flooded fields that stopped Soviet armor would also swallow civilian homes, livestock, and livelihoods. The plan balanced on a knife's edge, feasible in engineering terms, but fraught with the danger of losing control. As the water rose, so did the possibility that the very defense meant to save the country could become a disaster of its own making. At the edge of the North Sea, when the dikes gave way in February 1953, water swept through Zeeland in the darkness, swallowing entire villages before dawn. Survivors remember the sound first, a deep, relentless roar, then the shock of icy water bursting through doors. More than 1,800 people died that night. Families climbed onto rooftops, clinging to each other as the flood rose, waiting for rescue that sometimes never came. One witness later recalled that they heard the cattle bellowing, saw the water rise past the windows, and then the house began to move, and that their father shouted for them to hold hands, but the current pulled them apart. The landscape that had been home for generations became an endless sea, scattered with debris and silence. For the Dutch, the memory of that disaster lingered in every debate about using water as a weapon. The cost was measured not only in hectares lost, but in lives and trust washed away. International law draws a line between military necessity and the protection of civilians, but that line blurs in the shadow of total war. The doctrine of proportionality, central to the Geneva Conventions, demands that the harm to civilian life and property must not outweigh the anticipated military advantage. Yet, the Igesel line plan pressed hard against these boundaries. Legal scholars today question whether sacrificing entire communities, even in the name of national survival, can ever be justified. The list of critical assets, dikes, pumping stations, and farmlands, reads like a roster of civilian lifelines, not military targets. Inundation would have transformed homes and livelihoods into a temporary battlefield, exposing the vulnerability of infrastructure woven into daily life. The ethical dilemma remains unresolved. Can a democracy write off its own people as obstacles in the calculus of alliance defense? The answer, even decades later, is uneasy and incomplete. Even now, Europe's frontiers depend on choices about infrastructure, sovereignty, and sacrifice. As climate volatility and new threats test old defenses, the line between protection and peril grows thin. In the calculus of security, whose land becomes expendable, remains a question that echoes into every alliance today.